Welcome once again to Strategy to Action. I'm Paul Richards. Our guest is Dr. Keita Demming. Keita, thank you for joining us once again.
Thank you for having me. Looking forward to it again.
We got some really good feedback from our first podcast. So just for those who may not have seen that one, let's just do a recap. And one of the main points we covered in the first one, because your book is titled Strategy to Action. And we covered the issue of organizations or companies looking at their interactions, not from a machine-based perspective, as many do, input versus output, but from a communication output where everyone in the organization's voice is valued and they feel safe. Let's recap that thought process a bit.
Yeah. So the language we use is, or we tend to use the metaphor of organizations as machines versus organizations as conversations. And the reason we think the metaphor thing is so important, and I'll give you an example, is I once worked with a startup, and the guy was struggling with his team. And he kept calling them family, family, family. Like, my family's so good, this group is like a family. And I said, what would be different for you if you thought about it as a team and not a family? But the best team always plays. And his immediate answer, he almost surprised himself with his answer, was saying there were three or four people who wouldn't be on the team. So in his example, what happened is that the family metaphor was blocking him from even considering restructuring the team in the way he needed to do it. So metaphors end up being really, really important, and we don't realize that they control the way we look, the questions we ask, the way we see things. And I fundamentally believe that because we think of organizations as machines and not conversations, we miss the whole human side of it, where we're not paying attention to what's motivating people, what are the conversations we need to have that really do drive revenue and measurable results.
What is the importance of having every employee, no matter what level you may be at structurally in a company, feeling that their voice and their thoughts are valued?
So that's interesting. The importance of that is that all of us, no matter what sector we're in, we're competing against other people. So we need a competitive advantage somewhere. One of the easiest places to get that competitive advantage is in the way employees feel about their everyday work. So a good friend of mine, an author, David Burgess, talks about what's the cause worth fighting for. When you pay attention to people, you can double, triple, quadruple the output because people are doing small things that they won't be doing in another company. So let's say I come to work and I just want a paycheck, and I come to work 9 to 5. I do my thing and I leave and I'm doing my job. You can't fire me because I'm doing my job. But if I come in and I'm engaged and I'm saying, hey, this process here could be better, let's make that more efficient. This process here, I noticed that our clients are getting stuck here. What if we reduce friction in this particular way? The That becomes like compounding interest, and the cumulative effects of people doing that kind of work makes your company outperform anybody else who just has robots or automatons who believes that people don't need to be engaged in these very human ways. Because the thing that AI or robots can't compete with is our creativity, our judgment, our reasoning, our insight. And that puts you on a real competitive advantage, especially whether it's AI, whether it's another company, whether it's whatever it is. Paying attention to the human, I think, becomes a very strategic advantage.
So employees or team members who feel valued
Yeah.
engage more, and they don't just go through the motions. They're actually engaged in whatever they're doing to the point that they produce more by dint of that.
Hey, so let me ask you a question. Have you ever had a conversation with somebody and they're physically present, but you know they're mentally and emotionally somewhere else?
Absolutely. The vacancy in their eyes tells you everything.
Exactly. And how does that feel?
Well, disengaged. Like, why are we going through this process? It's pretty robotic. It's routine.
So you get a similar thing with employees who are showing up physically, but they're not engaged. You get it's the same effect. That's what it feels like to work in a company like that. Feeling what it feels like to work in a company where people are truly engaged is like when you have a really good conversation with somebody and you're like, wow, that conversation was amazing. Whether you solve world poverty or whatever, or hunger or whatever it is you solved in that conversation, that's the difference that you get. And that difference makes all everything because it gives you a competitive advantage in a way that's not that expensive, and it just focuses on What do people value? What are they interested in? I'll give you an example. I'm working with a company right now, and the challenge in that organization is that the past leadership just decided where he put people. And people were super frustrated because he was like, person A is like, you put me in this job here, but my strength is in where you put person B. And person B was like, that makes no sense. I'll be better if I play in position where you put person A. And he wasn't talking to people. So they kind of had like this small mutiny and went to him and said, hey, consult with us and put us in the right spot. Once he did that, he saw performance absolutely change because people were in their right spots and they knew like they were valued, they knew their opinions were being taken into consideration. So that is simple thing like that where understanding how we get people to work at the highest level of their capability and engaging in that it makes a big difference. He went from being very frustrated with his company wanting to quit to now he's back engaged, he's enjoying it and loving it and all that. So
So that approach really makes a difference in terms of how the organization interacts and how it progresses. Now, your book is called Strategy to Action. What are the biggest misnomers or misunderstandings about that word strategy and what it means or what it should mean?
there's a guy called Roger Martin who talks about this really well, but the number one thing that has happened is that we engage in a strategy planning process versus engaging in what I would consider is actually having a particular strategy. So strategy planning is okay, we are going to do XYZ, we're going to buy this many more buildings, we're going to um, invest in these number of new machinery things, that's the plan for the year. A strategy is something that puts you in a position where you are able to meet the customer's need in a way that guarantees you win, where you choose that. And that's a strategy. So for example, a strategy might be, let's say we are going to reuse existing resources as much as possible. That's a strategy. Versus let's buy 3 new tractors this year. That's a plan. The first example, people don't really understand that. And how I often do that is I say to people, draw 3 columns. In one column, you have outcome. So what do you want as a result of that? Which is what people usually call strategy. So our strategy is to grow by 5%. 5% growth is an outcome. Then you put in the next column of strategy. We're going to do that by improving customer acquisition or reducing friction in our sales process. That's a strategy as an example. And then the tactic is the thing you're going to do on the ground. So we're going to implement this particular software. We're going to hire this particular programmer. That's the thing that you tactically do on the ground. So if you just draw those 3 columns, it's super simple. But what you do, that forces you to get out of misconstruing an outcome for a strategy and a tactic for a strategy, because all of a sudden you're looking at the 3 columns and you're like, oh, what I have in that strategy column is actually an outcome. So you put in the outcome thing. What I have in that strategy bucket is actually a tactic. So what is my actual strategy? And that's where most people get really, really um, confused, or they don't do that very well. I'll give you an example, and this is a very old example. But Napoleon did this thing where he was in this war and he surrounded the enemy. And part of that was his strategy was that he wanted to win that war without ever having to shoot a bullet. And once the British realized, hey, we're surrounded, there's no way to get out of this, they surrendered and he was able to win that. That's what we mean by strategy. Real strategies in the war context is that you win without ever having to shed blood. You win without ever having to shoot a bullet. If you have a real strategy in place, and you have to begin to think at that deeper, more intentional level. I don't think a lot of people really understand what that means.
It sounds very easily measurable too in terms of the 3 columns and what should happen in each column, and the way you actually realize assess if you are realizing your objectives, the objectives of the strategy, and the goals of the organization.
Yeah, it sounds like that, but I do this all the time in workshops, and I could tell you spend hours on, is that a strategy or is that an outcome? Or is that a strategy or is it a tactic?
Mhm.
And the beautiful piece about all of that also is that having that conversation with your team builds engagement. They begin to really understand why we're doing X, Y, Z. Because we just spent some time debating, oh, this is our real strategy. We're going to utilize existing resources so that we're not increasing our expenses at the same time as improving the product, right? So there's a big there's lots of benefits to this whole approach to organizations as conversations. How do we engage a human? It sounds soft, but it really is one of the keys to performance and keys to getting competitive advantage over anybody else who might be in your market.
Now, speaking of strategy, most organizations, even if they do that successfully, they go from strategy to tactic to outcome. They will encounter challenges and problems, and they have to engage in some sort of problem solving approach.
Mm.
How do you think about problem solving in the organization, even as you go from tactic to achieve a goal in the context of strategy?
So one of the first things I noticed is that I come from an academic background initially. So at the time I was working for this think tank that we dealt with only complex problems. So we're dealing with like how do we solve how do we make sure that immigrants who come to Canada at the time I was working in Canada thrive when they get here? How do we reduce drug reduction? How do we do um, poverty stuff? So all those things are very big, complex problems, big, hairy, wicked problems is what we call them. And one of the things that I found most valuable in that work was a woman by the name of Brenda Zimmerman who made a distinction between what kind of problem are you facing? Are you facing a simple problem, a complicated problem, or a complex problem? And what she did is she used metaphors again to help us understand what that means. So a simple problem is like baking a cake, a recipe for a cake. So if you think about like a Betty Crocker's cake, not necessarily me, but most people will take a Betty Crocker's cake and come out with a cake at the end of it and they get a good product. You take something like so that's a simple problem. It's a recipe, it's a formula, you follow step by step, you're going to get a very predictable result. A complex problem, a complicated problem is more like launching a rocket, hosting a party for 20,000 people, hosting a conference for 50,000 people. With enough time and resources, you can figure out what that is. With enough time and resources and the right expertise, you can solve that issue. A blown up version of a simple problem. So the complicated issue. Now the difference here is a complex problem. A complex problem is it's responsive or adaptive or dynamic. And the analogy we use is raising a kid. So as soon as I change my parenting strategy, the child changes their response. And when the child changes their response, I now need to change my parenting strategy. It's always growing and there's always things to change around it. We don't make a distinction between simple, complicated, and complex problems. And that becomes an issue because what we do is, in general, is a gross generalization, is we approach most problems as if it was simple or complicated. Very few times do we actually approach problems as if they're complex. Classic example of this is, hey, I need some team building work. I'm going to hire this consultant to come in and do a 1 day training session, and my team building will be done. That assumes that the analogy I use in the book was my brother's a mechanic, and this is the machine metaphor again. If he needs to fix the car, he just replaces a part. That's simple, it runs. In a team, if you have a toxic team member, it's not as simple as taking out the one toxic team member because that person has now created pain and hurt and all of that. You have to engage in a process of restorative justice, a process of healing, etc. So we are dealing with a complex problem. And because we approach problems from the wrong lens, we're not approaching them in with the right number of resources or now we're not enough time, we're not spending enough time with them. And as a result, when things we don't get the results we want, we think all kinds of things other than, oh, you know what? From the start, we weren't looking at this through the right glasses or the right lens.
How complicated or I shouldn't use that word, how challenging is it to reorient organizational leadership to these new approaches? Because human beings are, in some instances, under some conditions, very resistant to change and doing things differently.
It's a great question, but my experience is that if you show people rather than tell people, you often get a lot better results. So if I tell you, hey, it's better to have an approach that really acknowledges that there are three kinds of problems: simple, complicated, complex. Now we're having an intellectual conversation. But if I am somehow able to show you, hey, we have this problem, we're going to approach it in this way, and we have this problem, we're going to approach it in this way. This one gets better results versus this one. You've now seen that, so the conclusion is yours. It's not mine. I haven't told you what to do. Like if you have a teenager, anybody has teenagers, you tell a teenager not to do X, they're going to do X. So you want to show rather than tell as a general principle. That's number one. And then there's another piece that I think is a very tricky one. But I think when you're talking to somebody, take into account the kind of training they have. So somebody who's an accountant, a lawyer, an engineer, they're trained in a particular way. Somebody who's a therapist, a psychologist, a sociologist, they're trained in a particular way. An anthropologist, they're trained in a particular way. It's easier to sell a complex problem kind of framework to anthropologists than it is to an engineer or mathematician, right? Or a lawyer who thinks like this is legal or it's not. It's looking for people who can do that gray area thinking and understanding that, hey, now those roles are very valuable. I'm not saying those roles are not valuable and that lens is not valuable. There are times when you want to have that gray area lens or gray area space where that's where we're sitting right now because that's the kind of thinking we need in this instance. And it's never easy. Um, I find understanding what training people have had and showing, not telling, those are the two easiest ways to
And
get
have
people.
you found, because coming from the social sciences myself, social science practitioners or academics are trained to listen because
Right.
listening is one of your primary tools in
Yeah.
terms of understanding. In some of the other hard sciences, mathematics, even law, you are trained to look at facts and make decisions without a lot of conversations because it's either X or Y will work for to achieve A or Z outcome. Is that a difficult transition because of someone's training? Because training is socialization, and in those uh, academic sciences or academic endeavors, those persons are many times trained for efficiency and not to walk a progression along in terms of achieving a particular outcome. How do you make that distinction in terms of? And I agree with you that understanding one's training helps you to understand how to approach it, but that may be the difference between, as you said, a complex or a complicated
Right.
challenge or problem.
So that's a really good example, but let's break that down a little bit further. I'm adding more complexity to it. So folks who are listening, let's let me nerd out for a bit and have some patience with me. But as a social scientist, it's called social science. What we did is we tried to bring scientific principles to sociology or to the study of groups. Sociology focuses more on groups and psychology focuses more on the individual. We tried to do what we basically tried to do was bring a reductionist approach. And reductionist just means you want to reduce it down to this is the cause of this particular thing. So again, if you want to fix a car, it's this part that's wrong, and you can fix it. You can reduce things down. So that worked really well in the era of Ford, like machine kind of thinking. The industrial era worked really, really well. The challenge is that thinking is not unique to engineering, the sciences, because we impose that thinking on the social sciences, if that makes sense. We try to put science onto the social science, not realizing that was a completely different paradigm. So, paradigm does two things: it determines the rules of the game and determines the boundaries in which you play. Once you change your paradigm, you change the rules and you change the boundaries in which you play. So, people who are in that sociology realm, they might value qualitative research more than quantitative. They might value, hey, I'm going to talk to the people on the ground, get their insights, and that's more valuable for them. So, what I'm kind of speaking to is I don't think because you've been trained as a sociologist means that you're going to be, it's easy for you to come and think in this way. I think the dominant paradigm in the way we view the world is a reductionist scientific one. And I'm saying there's an alternative reality which plays into how we build our societies. And in the organizational world, that's very, very hard to see people do that. Um, and it's not easy because the way we educate people is one plus one is two versus one plus one is maybe. That's not going to happen. I get marks for one plus one is two. I don't get marks for one plus one is maybe, right? So I don't think it's as that simple, and it's something I struggle with a lot. And I do think it comes down to the way we've progressed as a science, as a species, because science is the most powerful thing we've done as human beings. We've
It,
created electricity
yeah.
without talking, So
The next question is going to be sound like a strangely simplistic question, but it's something that I had to go through in postgraduate training. And when it was first asked of me or us as a group, we all dismissed it as it's a no-brainer. But in the context of a conversation, do you think people understand how to listen? And are there ways that people need to learn to listen? Because we thought in the exercises that we had to go through, well, everybody can listen. You stop talking and you listen. You understand? And we learned over a period of 3 months that listening in the right way for the right outcomes wasn't as simple as we thought. It's just to be silent and let the person throw stuff at you. It was a lot more nuanced, a lot more. It considered a lot more engagement, a lot more introspection and self examination, as opposed to just stopping to talk and let the other person contribute. What are your thoughts on the art of listening for more effective conversations?
So number one, I think we could do a whole day workshop on just the art of listening. That's number one. Number two, I think if you want to start by having a better conversation, start by learning how to listen better. And number three, I'm just gonna just talk about active listening for a bit. So the way active listening is taught is like you shake your head and look at the person in the eyes and stuff. That's a performative approach to listening as far as I'm concerned. What are you listening for? Right? So I have a lot of friends who are therapists, and I could be in a conversation with them, and they will hear things that you're like, so what I'm hearing you say, and they wrap it back, and you're like, whoa, I didn't even hear that, but they did say that. Because if I say 10 words in any conversation, I could pick up on any one of those, like maybe 5 of them, and go in a particular direction of that. But because of the way language is, those 10 words have a lot more meaning because of the way language is. So if I say to you a word like a cup could mean all kinds of things. It's a category for a bunch of different things. And that's a piece that ends up being very um, tricky to manage in listening. Because a lot of what you do recognize in listening is what's not being said. What is the person saying but not really saying? So there's a Irish saying which I use a lot. Um, say something but say nothing is kind of the quote, something like that. Say anything but don't say anything at all. And that's a way of how people talk, and they have voice, but they're not actually saying anything. And sometimes if you listen to people, some leaders, quote unquote leaders, when you listen to them, like, wait a minute, that sounded really eloquent. But if you really listen, he's not saying much. So I think the listening piece is really, really hard, but you have to focus on what are you listening for? What is the person saying they want more of or less of? And we could do a whole day workshop on that alone, and we have done them. But you're right, listening is definitely a complex skill that I think if more people took courses on how to listen, the world would be a much better place. Like people like you who interview, you get an air for listening.
But I had to be trained for 3 months to listen, and I thought they were wasting my time until I finished the course, and I realized that it was extremely, extremely important to understand the art of listening. So we don't have 26 sessions. If you were to give some tips for organizations, and in particular all levels of organizations, in the context of the importance of conversations, in how we should be listening, what would those be? In the importance of certain approaches to listening for more productive outcomes or more engagement, I should say, what would those be?
I'll give you one. listen for what people want. What are they saying they want more of? That's what you're listening for. Start to listen to people give you clues and tell you what they want more of. So somebody who's complaining is telling you they want less of this thing, and what we end up doing is we end up following them down that rat hole. So you want to listen for what people want more of. And if you just did that, I do that as an experiment for a week. When you're talking to somebody, listen for what does this person want more of. That exercise alone, and it would
Yes.
transform your conversations.
You sound like a therapist friend of mine, a counselor friend of mine who does a lot of marriage counseling. And one of the best bits of advice that she gave or she gives to couples, and you know, a lot of what we're talking about here is about organizations, but it works in people's personal lives also, is when two people in a relationship are having an disagreement or an argument, is to stop and say, what is this person trying to tell me that I am putting up a barrier to, that I am not hearing? Take down my needs and my wants for a moment and listen to what is this person really trying to tell me that, as you say, that they want. And sometimes we are so caught up in our own opinion and our own feelings in a particular topic, we don't listen in the same way because we have our perspective as a blocker to anything that person is trying to say. So what you're saying is resonating with me in terms of what does this person really want? What are they telling me I want? And I need to put aside my own needs for a moment and listen to what that person wants.
There's a very famous therapist. Her name is Esther Perel, and she talks about when somebody is criticizing or complaining to you, it's really a request. So if I say to you, "Hey, stop putting your clothes on the floor," I'm making a request from you. So what is the request behind the criticism is what you need to be able to begin to think about and understand.
And in our final 2 minutes, in terms of conversations for business and business performance, what are the most important elements that those conversations should contain? You very, very profoundly put the strategy in three columns, which were very easy to understand. Understanding which one should go in what is something else. That's another conversation. But in terms of understanding conversations and what is important and what we should be listening for, what we should be looking for, and how we should be proceeding, what would you say in closing?
I think clarity of where you want it to do your future direction is the utmost thing. If you know where you want to be 5, 10 years from now, that is an absolute game changer because as soon as you have a clear vision, it makes it so much easier to make decisions.
Where can we find the book?
Anywhere that books are sold online, Amazon, Barnes and Nobles, anywhere, and visit my website, keitademming.com.
All right, the book is called Strategy to Action. Thank you so much, Dr. Keita Demming. Always a wonderful conversation that starts in the organization but ends up very personally in some points. Thanks so much.
All right. Thank you for having me. See you next time. Looking forward to it.
Same here.
Bye bye.